Shakespeare is very good at identifying the element in the source that makes sense of the whole story.
Right.
And then he throws it away. And by making it opaque, he makes you think, what? Why is this happening?
Tell us about your theory about how the death of his son, Hamnet, and his processing of that eventually engendered Hamlet.
He cut something open in himself, took something out of himself and put it in the play. Shakespeare was not interested in dying at 30 years old, starving to death in a garret. So he bought a significant share in the corporation. And he also was a part owner of the physical theater itself.
Right.
So that's an incredible business model that no one else in the period really had. Protestants declared that the whole doctrine of purgatory was a fraud, and they got rid of it. But you can't simply say, basta finito, it doesn't exist anymore. The feeling still exists. The feeling exists now.
What makes Shakespeare so great? What are the sources of his genius? Those are questions that have been hotly debated for centuries, and here's why. Shakespeare was a young man from a provincial town without independent wealth, family connections, or a university education. And yet he went on to become the greatest playwright of all time. He went on to master both comedy and tragedy, to entertain the learned and the unlettered, to accurately depict the lives of peasants and kings. His achievements are so broad and unbelievable that there's a whole cottage industry of wild conspiracies, that it must have been someone else writing in his name, an aristocrat, or multiple people, that he must have been a lawyer or a priest or served in the army. My guest today is one of the greatest Shakespeare scholars, Harvard's Stephen Greenblatt, who's going to give us a much more reasonable and interesting answer for where Shakespeare's genius really comes from. Greenblatt is going to take us into the grimy theatrical world of Shakespeare's England, which is far from what we would consider high culture today. The theater was next to brothels and gangs. It sometimes shared venues with animal baiting, where bears would be blinded and chased around by dogs for sport. We're going to learn how Shakespeare navigated this world, how he transmorphed the death of his son, Hamnet, into his greatest work, Hamlet, and how techniques we dismiss, like rote memorization, laid the foundation for Shakespeare's genius. My name is Jonathan B. I'm studying the great books and sharing their insights through lectures and interviews. If you want to join my journey and learn with me, please subscribe. And without further ado, Professor Stephen Greenblatt. You called Shakespeare the greatest playwright, not of his age alone, but of all time. What makes Shakespeare so singular?
If there was a single one-word answer to that,
you wouldn't have a job.
Wouldn't have a job, Jonathan, exactly. In a certain way, it's easier to say what doesn't make him good. It's not that he made up plots no one had ever thought of before. For the most part, that's not true. And it's not that he did transform the medium that he worked in, but the medium existed. He didn't invent a new medium. I mean, in the way that someone suddenly we're living in a world in which AI, for example, may actually totally change our lives. That the theater existed before it was new, but it existed before Shakespeare came along. So the answer has to do with fabulous quality of imagination, a limitless power of poetic intelligence and eloquence, some kind of deep human understanding that combines extraordinary intelligence with something that doesn't depend on fancy intelligence, but depends on a heart and soul that is open to the truths of things.
Right.
So all of those and more combined in a unusual mix, unexpected mix. But as I say, even as I say these words, I feel the almost comical inadequacy of them.
Right, I see. Well, I want to spend this entire interview trying to unpack this a bit more, to talk about Shakespeare's genius. And I want to start with this theatrical environment that he found himself in his really late teens and early 20s in London. So let's begin with geography, because the theater was not in the city center, it was in the entertainment district in the suburbs. Tell us a bit about this entertainment district.
Within the city of London, the civic authorities of Shakespeare's time didn't want and like the idea of the theater for a number of different reasons. There's a traffic problem. People arrive, too many people arrive. The theaters are daytime performances. People are taking off from work, crowding in the streets, riding up in their horses or carriages. The streets are jammed with people. Life is not going on as it should go on in a well-ordered city. Instead, there are these places with people are taking the afternoon off, and there are whores and there are pickpockets. The whole thing is a mess, coupled with the public health problems. So every year, almost, the London is visited by bubonic plague. Lots of people die, and the civic authorities have the wit to understand, the public health authorities have the wit to understand that there seems to be a spiking of the death rate if people gather together in large numbers. That said, they didn't try to stop people from going to church because they thought God couldn't possibly punish people for going to church. So that wouldn't increase the death rates, but they didn't like the theater to begin with. So if the death rates reached a certain number, they stopped them. But they tried to stop the public theater altogether, to get rid of it. But there were certain areas of the city that were out of their control. A small number of areas within the city, and then a large number of areas around the city, an entertainment district, and especially on the south side of the Thames. That's a disadvantage from the point of view of the theater companies, because people have to get across the river. They have to take off from work a little bit earlier. They have to pay a boatman to get them across, or they have to walk over to London Bridge and get across. But nonetheless, then they're not controlled by the civic authorities, and they can do what more or less what they want.
Right. What I want to emphasize is when we think about theater today, it's high art, it's high culture. But at that time, especially in the entertainment district, the theater was right next to brothels, right? It was right next to animal baiting,
Yes.
where it's like a gladiatorial arena. And I think this quote that I'm going to read right now from a visitor to London is going to be incredibly revealing just to what type of institution was the theater at the time. So he's describing his visiting of London. About 100 large English dogs were made to fight singly with 3 bears, the second bear being larger than the first and the third larger than the second. After this, a horse was brought in and chased by the dogs, and at last a bull who defended himself bravely. The next was that a number of men and women came forward from a separate compartment, dancing, conversing, and fighting with each other. Also, a man who threw some white bread among the crowd that scrambled for it. Right over the middle of the place, a rose was fixed, this rose being set on fire by a rocket. Suddenly, lots of apples and pears fell out of it, down upon the people standing below. After this, rockets and other fireworks came flying out of all corners. This is my favorite sentence. And that was the end of the play. They called this a play.
Yeah.
So this was the type of institution, to give people an idea, that the theater was in the time.
I mean, some of the theaters were. That certainly sounds like a lot of fun, but although maybe not fun for the bears and the dogs. The point is that one of the sources of Shakespeare's theater, of popular theater, are unbelievably crude popular entertainments, including cruel popular entertainments of the kind you described. And the bears, maybe worth noting, the bears were tied to a stake, so they couldn't run around. They're often blinded, I'm sorry to say, and the dogs would attack them. But I mention this because at the end of Macbeth, Macbeth says, "I'm tied to the stake and I must fight." Macbeth likens himself to a bear in a bear baiting. And there's a play by Ben Jonson, Shakespeare's contemporary rival and friend. This play is being performed where there have been bear baitings recently, and it still smells like bear shit in the theater. So that is to say, there is a way in which the venues can actually double one for another. I don't think that was true of the Globe Theater, where Shakespeare's plays after a certain point were performed, but they are very close together, and there is in a disturbing way some relationship between the spectacle of creatures being baited and tormented and cruelly punished, and then high art. And I suppose you could say that the closest we can get to this, perhaps, are if you go to a bullfight, that's a kind of ritual of cruelty and of skill in which death will be staged for
entertainment.
Right.
And I think as chaotic and lawless as the district that Shakespeare must have found himself in, his contemporary playwrights were somehow even more debaucherous. Yes. So tell us about these fascinating characters that Shakespeare found himself with.
I mean, Shakespeare found himself a broad social range of characters, some of whom, like his contemporary Thomas Lodge, came from a privileged background. Lodge was the somewhat dissolute son of the Lord Mayor of London, but wound up being a playwright. There's Thomas Nash, who was the son of a vicar from a provincial town. And Nash went to Cambridge University and then wound up writing plays in London. There's Christopher Marlowe, cobbler's son from Canterbury, who was training for the priesthood for the better part of 6.5 years at Cambridge University, but then decided to throw it all over and become a playwright, among other things, in London. And so there's a crazy range. And the big distinction here was who went to university and who didn't go to university. Right. So Nash, Marlowe, Robert Greene, these are all people who went to Oxford or Cambridge. Shakespeare, his contemporary Thomas Kyd, and a group of others didn't go to university. And there's tremendous tension between those groups. It's a question of whether they have the right social credentials, whether they could count as gentlemen because they have university degrees. So there's a famous moment in which Greene, on his deathbed, writes an attack on an upstart crow beautified with our feathers, he says. Beware the upstart crow beautified with our feathers, who thinks he's the only shake scene in the country. So he accuses Shakespeare of being an upstart and who stealing our glory, stealing our feathers.
But tell us about the type of shenanigans that Greene especially will get himself into, because as you describe, Greene is the inspiration or part of the inspiration for the infamous Falstaff.
Yes.
Right?
Greene is a complicated piece of work. Greene came from a modest background, but had a marvelous education and received degrees, in his case, both from Cambridge and Oxford, from the two great English universities, so has very fancy credentials, educational credentials, marries a respectable woman, moves to London, abandons his wife, leads a totally dissolute and crazy life. His mistress was a woman named M. Ball, E-M, like Emily, M. Ball, whose brother Cutting Ball, as he was called, was a criminal, thief, who eventually was hanged. He had red hair, and he grows his hair, which he must have pomaded into a point at the end of which he hanged a pearl. He's constantly drunk. He brags about the fact that he sells plays to two different companies. He writes accounts of what he calls coney catching, that how criminals trick naive people out of their money, and so forth and so on. He lives a absolutely debauched life, and then has stages. He does it very publicly. He writes about himself this way, and then he stages big rituals of repentance. Maybe real repentance, maybe fraudulent repentance. I mean, he writes about these things, and then dies super young. I can't remember his age, maybe 32. They're all dying around Shakespeare. There are very few of them manage to live reasonably long lives, but Nash dies in his early 30s. Christopher Marlowe is murdered at 29. Greene dies destitute. Right. As Greene is dying, he asks his landlady, he doesn't have any money, and he's basically starving, and he asks his landlady to put a laurel wreath around his head as a gesture of the sort of dying poet. I mean, these are basically crazy people who are trying desperately to make a living in this shadowy world. You could make some money writing plays. The pay was reasonably good for the time, but Shakespeare is doing something that no one else in this theater world was able to do. Shakespeare was an actor on stage. He was the principal playwright for his playing company. He bought a share, no one knows quite how, in the playing company because it was extremely expensive, and it was a kind of joint stock company, like a corporation. So he bought a significant share in the corporation. That meant that the box office receipts were partly going to him.
Right.
And he also he was a part owner of the physical theater itself.
Right.
So that's an incredible business model that no one else in the period really had. It was the idea of being a professional writer, not by finding a very wealthy patron, but by making money as a writer.
Right.
That was basically, we think of that as the invention of the 18th century, not the invention of the late 16th century, early 17th century. That's a wild thing to do.
I see.
And Shakespeare, no one knows where he came up with this crazy idea. And the answer must be, again, just he was gifted with this astonishing genius, and he didn't want to starve to death. So we think earlier in our conversation, we talked about the fact that Shakespeare was oddly interested in social class and money. Shakespeare was not interested in dying at 30 years old, starving to death in a garret.
Right.
It's perfectly reasonable from my perspective that Shakespeare wanted to live
comfortable life,
a sort of bourgeois life.
So we've painted the picture of both the geography, the theater district he was in, and the type of characters that he meshed himself in. I think what was really telling in your book is one of the people commented that Shakespeare was not a company keeper, that he didn't really enmesh himself into the shenanigans that these other playwrights were involved in. But I think what is significant in our conversation about Shakespeare's genius is I found it surprising how much copying there was between these playwrights. I mean, they would be inspired by the themes that each other were writing, but sometimes they would just literally steal plots or individual lines out of each other. And so this goes back to one of your comments earlier on, that Shakespeare's genius is not in his originality.
I mean, they work together like television writing, where you get groups of people in a writing room writing episodes of Breaking Bad or The Simpsons or whatever together. We're not talking about, every once in a while you find someone who's a single author of a significant piece of television entertainment. But for the most part, these are written by multiple people. There's considerable evidence, partly computer driven, that Shakespeare's early history plays, the Henry VI plays, were written collaboratively by Shakespeare and probably Christopher Marlowe, and maybe a third person. Later in Shakespeare's career, I think the plays are, by and large, with very few exceptions, written entirely by Shakespeare.
Right.
But that's unusual. Most of the time, people are working together, and I think of Shakespeare, Jonathan, as being rather careful about these. I think he was good at working with others, but I think he was probably rather careful about how close he got to the others. I think of Shakespeare
for obvious reasons.
Yeah, for obvious reasons. I think he got, first of all, he's a married man. And I think also he got that he's dealing with people who are not going to have long lives.
Right.
I mean, if you knew Christopher Marlowe and you had your eyes open, as Shakespeare clearly has his eyes open, you would think, oh my God, how long is this person going to be alive? And then when Marlowe leaned over to you and said, what do you think about the Earl of Southampton? Don't you think he's cute? You might not want to answer, yeah, I think he's cute. Or when
Marlowe's gay, right?
When Marlowe was gay, or when Marlowe was fishing for Shakespeare's religious beliefs. Don't you think that most of what goes on in our church is bullshit? I think Shakespeare might have not been a company keeper there. I think he knew that this was a very dangerous road to walk down.
I see. Okay, so you talked about collaboration. I want to explore another way in which Shakespeare's plays are not original, which is the plot themselves.
Yes.
I mean, most of the history plays at least, he's got Plutarch in front of him and just copies directly. And I tied this in your book with, I think, how Shakespeare was educated earlier on. So let me give you a quote. This is talking about Shakespeare's grammar school education. The instruction was not gentle. Rote memorization, relentless drills, endless repetition, daily analysis of texts, elaborate exercises in imitation and rhetorical variation, all backed up by the threat of violence. Latin learning, for example, was inseparable from whipping. One educational theorist at the time speculated that the buttocks were created in order to facilitate the learning of Latin. A good teacher was by definition a strict teacher. Pedagogical reputations were made by the vigor of the beatings administered. As part of his final examination at Cambridge, a graduate in grammar in the late Middle Ages was required to demonstrate his pedagogical fitness by flogging a dull boy. Mm-hmm. Rote memorization. We attribute that with mere copycats, not with genius, right? Taking the plot from others is not praise today if you're an artist. What changed?
Well, first of all, one thing that changed was in the 18th century, starting the 18th century, they invented copyright. There is no copyright in this period. And there's no sense that of all the things that go behind copyright, including the cult of slightly fraudulent cult of originality, because as you know perfectly well, if you watch movies, if you look at movies, you listen to music, that actually there's a tremendous amount of copying, though now we have much more in the way of attempts to control legally what can be pinched from somebody else and what can't be. But there's none of that in Shakespeare's time, and no one thinks that borrowing a plot from Plutarch or from Robert Greene, from a short story that he wrote, no one thinks that that is an inappropriate thing to do. No one thinks that that is diminishing your gifts.
But as you said, it's not just a legal change, right? There's a change in the very idea of what genius meant, right? That the originality is added on. It's more highly praised today. Do you think it's right for us to elevate originality so high when we consider who's a genius?
I mean, I think to some extent we pretend to praise originality, not quite acknowledging the extent to which what our culture is constantly producing imitations of imitations of imitations, but within a different set of rules. So that's part of the answer. Part of the answer, in the case of Shakespeare, has to do with it was meant to be about pleasure, and the pleasure of Shakespeare had to do, among other things, with the rich complexity of Shakespeare's language. And that's because actually in Shakespeare's world, pretty much everyone, and I don't mean only the educated classes, but pretty much everyone was much more sophisticated than we are at processing extremely complicated syntactical constructions and metaphorical constructions for a very good reason, because they were forced to listen to a million sermons. And because if they had any education at all, as we started to say, they were forced to memorize a ridiculous amount of stuff. We don't do that anymore. Actually, I'm extremely grateful to the teachers I couldn't stand when I was in high school for making me memorize a bunch of stuff. I have a lot of it in my head, but I hated it at the time. And it totally dropped out of education now. Right. But I have a ton of things that I was forced to memorize and stand up and perform. And Shakespeare had infinitely more of that. The result in Shakespeare's time was that ordinary people could not only listen to, but process very, very, very complicated verbal constructions. It happens because Shakespeare was unbelievably clever, that ordinary people can listen to his plays and understand what the hell is going on.
Right.
But if you actually try, the reason that reading Shakespeare is harder than listening to Shakespeare is if you try to figure out what exactly is being said here, if you slow it down, it's very difficult. And the reason it's very difficult is it's syntactically and poetically very rich.
Right, I see.
And that's because they all were used to this. They could handle this. We can't handle it to the same degree.
In education today, everyone frowns down upon rote memorization. But so I spent a lot of my early years in the Chinese education system, and you were forced to memorize the Chinese classics, right? This is poetry, the great literature of the time. I can barely recite maybe only just 2 or 3 of the poems, but what it gives me, I think, is poetic sensibility, for the lack of a better word, right? It gives you a sense of taste, of a rhythm. So that is what we lose from not having our kids memorize stuff.
No, absolutely.
Memorize good stuff.
Absolutely. My older Italian friends can recite huge swatches of Dante, which they just have in their heads now. I have Chinese friends who can recite the Song of Everlasting Love. I'm not arguing that people should start beating children up and forcing them to memorize. As I say, I rather hated it when I was a kid myself, but it's totally in my head now. I did once have a conversation with, at a reception with Bill Clinton, and he alluded to Macbeth, to memorize a lot of Macbeth when he was in high school. And so when I had a chance to shake hands with him in the receiving line, I said, "Do you still remember those lines?" "Oh, sure," he said. And he recited a huge swatch of Macbeth. "When 'tis done, if 'tis done, when 'tis done, then 'twere well it would done quickly." I can barely recite it now. But he went on to a huge amount of that he still had in his head.
Right.
Now, he has obviously photographic memory. He couldn't retain it that long.
Right.
But it's an enormous gift to be able to possess.
Right, I see.
A huge amount of that.
I want to keep pushing and exploring where Shakespeare's genius comes from. And I think we've unlocked part of the answer, and it's very surprising to the modern ear. It has to do with memorization. But let's now investigate Hamlet. You called Hamlet Shakespeare's greatest tragedy, that it was a step function beyond his previous tragedies, for example, that were already great, like Julius Caesar. And it created another epoch, like King Lear, like Macbeth in his later years, that was different in kind and not just in degree. What makes Hamlet so unique?
Hamlet retains more of Shakespeare's inside than anything he'd written to that point. And to some extent, most of what he wrote afterwards. But you have to preface this by saying that part of Shakespeare's genius from the beginning, already from Comedy of Errors, I think, depended on his weird gift that's extremely hard to describe, and I don't have a very good word for it, of, how should we say, cutting off pieces of himself or out of himself and putting them not under his name, because he's very recessive. He never stages himself. But in Hamlet, you get a glimpse of it much more vividly than you do you get closer to seeing that he cut something open in himself, right. Took something out of himself and put it in the play. I think that is probably true of most great art that matters, that it actually depends upon some kind of hidden transfer of something from the artist into the work that will survive her or survive him. But in Hamlet, there's an extraordinary amount of that.
Right. And it should come as no surprise once I describe to the audience what you speculate that event is, which is the death of Shakespeare's own son, Hamnet. So tell us about your theory about how the death of his son, Hamnet, and his processing of that eventually engendered Hamlet.
I mean, eventually is an important word here because it was by no means immediate. Shakespeare's son died at the age of 11 back in 1596. So it was several years after the son died. Shakespeare might not have known that the son was dying. We don't know the cause. Might have been plague. It might have been something else. He might not have been able to make it back to Stratford in time for the funeral even. I mean, we simply don't know. Shakespeare's son, his only boy, died at, as they say, the age of 11. And it was not for several years after that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. It happens that Shakespeare's son's name was effectively Hamlet, that the name Hamnet and Hamlet were interchangeable in the period. Shakespeare named his twin children, Judith and Hamnet, after his neighbors, Judith and Hamnet Sadler. But Hamnet Sadler is listed in the Stratford town records very often as Hamlet Sadler. So the names were interchangeable. So it is very striking that there's some profound relationship between Shakespeare writing a play about a father and son named Hamlet in the wake of his own son's death. And what I became interested in, and I wrote a whole book about this, a book called Hamlet in Purgatory, is about what was happening or what had happened in Shakespeare's culture to the processing of of the dead, psychological processing of the dead. What I mean by that simply is that Catholic culture had and still has a doctrine of purgatory. That is to say, a middle space between heaven and hell, in which souls who are not either completely bad in a state of mortal sin or completely good in a state of sanctity go to have their sins purged from them in fires. The traditional Catholic Church, lots of the things you're looking at have to do with the cult of purgatory, even if you don't know about it. But just before Shakespeare was born, in the generation before Shakespeare was born, the English Church, the Church of England, decided to get rid of the doctrine of purgatory. Because Calvin, generally the Protestants, said it was a fraud, there was no such thing.
There was a big religious conflict at the time.
There was a huge religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics, in which the Protestants declared that the whole doctrine of purgatory was a fraud, a confidence game to rip you off. And they got rid of it. But, life is not so simple as that. You can't have a centuries-old doctrine in which you could pray for the dead, in which you could try to do things to help the dead along, in which you could be in a constant communication with the dead. Even though they were gone, you could still, as it were, do something for them, speak to them, be in some relation to them. You can't simply say, basta finito, it doesn't exist anymore. The feeling still exists. The feeling exists now. So the question is what people in Shakespeare's world did in the generation after the official account was that they could no longer pray for the dead. And Shakespeare writes a play in 1600 or 1601 after his son has died, and when his father probably was dying, he writes a play about a father who comes to his son and says, I'm in a place where my sins are being burned and purged away. Doesn't call it purgatory because they wouldn't have allowed that to occur on stage, but that's as close as you could possibly get to saying, I'm in purgatory and I want you to remember me. It's a place saturated by the dream of being remembered after death. And that incredibly powerful feeling about processing what it means to have lost someone that you care about and not to be in relation to him. This is a play called Hamlet, the name of his son. There is a theory that Shakespeare continued to be a crypto-Catholic all his life. I don't think so. I think that he was post-Catholic or post-Christian. Right. But he's processing things through the language of Christianity, right, and here through the language of Catholicism, right, through the doctrine of Catholicism, through the doctrine of purgatory.
Right. And it's only with that deep sadness and turmoil that he went through, by internalizing that into the play, that is where the greatness of Hamlet, yes, your theory, ultimately comes from. I want to highlight one argument I found very convincing in your book, is how Shakespeare's Hamlet, differs from the traditional account of Hamlet, because Hamlet, like we described, is a plot borrowed from someone else. The traditional account of Hamlet is Hamlet's uncle kills his dad, and Hamlet has to feign madness because the uncle knows that Hamlet knows, right? But
because in the source, it's completely open. It's not a secret killing at all.
Yeah,
it happens. Everyone knows it. It's an
everyone knows it. Yeah. So Hamlet in the original source, not Shakespeare's play, you need to feign madness. Otherwise, his uncle is going to kill him, right? But Shakespeare took that away in his telling. In Shakespeare, Hamlet still goes mad, but not to feign madness for his own survival. And your argument in your book is that it's precisely by obscuring the motives, by not giving a clear explanation of why he goes mad, that this interiority is added. I mean, to bring it back to his son, Hamlet, it's the idea that Shakespeare is refusing any easy answers of easy consolation. Is that right?
Yes. In Saxo Grammaticus, the Danish source for the story that Shakespeare used, Hamlet, the son, is a little boy. A very small little boy. He's not nearly old enough to try to undertake the revenge that he's supposed to undertake to avenge his father. So the obvious thing, if he were older, would be for the murderer to kill him. Why would you want someone who's obliged to avenge his father's death around? But the little boy very cleverly pretends that he's mad and therefore is kept around as a kind of joke in the Danish court until he's old enough to be able to do what he knows that he's supposed to do, to avenge his father. In Shakespeare's version of this, he throws this coherent motive out. He has Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, pretend he's mad, but it's a terrible idea to pretend you're mad because it calls attention to yourself rather than distracts anyone. I'm, Jonathan, proud of very, very little that I'm able to think new about Shakespeare, because people, very, very brilliant people, much more brilliant than I, have thought about Shakespeare for generations. But about this, I actually am rather proud that I realized that not just in Hamlet, but more or less systematically in relation to his sources, Shakespeare tries to identify, and is very good at identifying, the element in the source that makes sense of the whole story, and then he throws it away. And I call it, in my book, I call it strategic opacity. He takes out strategically the element that clarifies everything. He makes it opaque. And by making it opaque, he makes you think, what? Why is this happening? He engages you in a very different way in the story.
But it's not incoherence, because the reason becomes interior, right? And this goes to your point about a deepening interiority. So let me end our interview by trying to give an answer to the question of Shakespeare's genius, of where he comes from. Shakespeare's genius comes from intimate familiarity with the greatest literary masterpieces known to man, and a superhuman sensitivity from his own life experiences. How's that?
It's pretty good. I would say, I mean, that's wonderful. I would add two pieces to what you've said very eloquently. One is that he knew the greatest masterpieces, and he also knew a lot of junk. He actually read a lot of crazy things. He encountered a lot of things. He never missed anything that seemed to be happening, including those bear baitings and fireworks displays. Right. He just got it all from the lowest level up to the highest level.
That's why he could write not only like an aristocrat, but also like a peasant, right?
And the second thing to say is, by his experience, you mean both what's deep inside him, to which he's weirdly sensitive, but also just the crazy world that's around him. The Greens and the Nashes and the Marlowes and the person who's selling him his bread and picking up after him in his room.
Right.
And that he's incredibly sensitive to.
I see. Well, thank you, Professor, for a fascinating interview.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at greatbooks.io. You'll not only get lectures and interviews, but also transcripts, book summaries, and essays, all to help you explore the most important books in history. If you like this interview, there's two more I filmed with Professor Greenblatt on Shakespeare's life and thought. One of the interviews investigates why there are no good marriages in Shakespeare, despite there being so many instances of passionate courtship. The other interview is about Shakespeare's social ambition, how he went from a commoner to a gentleman, and how this type of social mobility is depicted in his plays. Now, another direction you can go is to explore one of Shakespeare's plays. Personally, Julius Caesar is by far my favorite. It's about a world historic event with captivating protagonists and shocking relevance to our political moment today. If that interests you, check out my lecture on Shakespeare's Caesar. You can find links to everything we discussed today in the description, as well as on my website, greatbooks.io. Thank you.